My story cannot be understood without understanding the life I shared with my mother. To speak of her absence without speaking of her presence is to tell only half the truth. She was not just my mother, she was the pulse of our family, the invisible force that held everything together. Her strength was quiet, often unrecognized, but it was relentless. Growing up, I had taken her presence for granted. I assumed she would always be there, the steady hand in the chaos, the one who mended wounds both physical and invisible. It never occurred to me that someone so central to my life could be removed entirely, leaving a vacuum that nothing else could fill. We lived in a small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone else's business, but few knew the private burdens people carried. Appearance mattered more than reality. Strength was expected, vulnerability was quietly frowned upon, and grief, if it had to be felt at all, was to be endured silently. My mother embodied all of this. She worked tirelessly at a modest office job, long hours that never seemed to end. Yet she always returned home with the energy to tend to a household that had expanded after my father passed away when I was very young. She managed our finances, our home, our education, and our emotional well-being, often without complaint. She carried burdens I could barely understand at the time, and I assumed her endurance was natural, like breathing. The economic pressures of our lives were constant. Losing my father meant that she had to become both parent and provider, protector and teacher. She took on additional work to ensure we were not deprived of opportunities, yet she did it with an unspoken grace. I grew up seeing her juggle numbers, schedules, and crises with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. And yet, there was always an underlying tension, inarticulate, the fatigue in her eyes, the occasional tremor in her hands as she closed a ledger, the subtle way she avoided her own exhaustion by focusing on our needs first. Her sacrifices were invisible to the world, and to me, they were background noise, part of the rhythm of daily life I took for granted. Culturally, our society did not prioritize open emotional expression, especially for women. Talking about feelings was indirect, filtered through stories or advice, rather than candid confession. My mother expressed love through actions rather than words, through the small, consistent ways she showed care. She made meals I liked, remembered little details about my life, and sat quietly when I needed to vent, never pressing, never judging. She was the embodiment of what love could be when it was patient, selfless, and enduring. But this form of love, while beautiful, also left me ill-prepared for the kind of emotional vulnerability required to navigate the world after her loss. I had learned love as duty, as care, as constancy, but never as fragility, as something that could disappear. Even before she passed, there were signs that her health was not what it seemed. Subtle, almost imperceptible. The way she winced when lifting a pot of water. The mornings when she lingered longer at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if bracing herself against the day. But these were small things, easily dismissed amid the demands of school, work, and daily life. I was a child in my early teens then, and children often assume adults are indestructible. I assumed she was invincible. That assumption became one of the cruelest illusions of my life. Our neighborhood, while friendly and interconnected, reinforced the notion that suffering should be private. People would offer help when asked, but asking was often seen as weakness. Grief was an internal journey, one to be endured in solitude. That societal expectation shaped how I responded to her illness and eventual passing. I believed, unconsciously, that expressing pain too loudly would be inappropriate, that I should continue performing the role of dutiful child, responsible sibling, functional adult. And yet, no amount of duty could shield me from the devastation of losing her. At home, her influence was omnipresent. She had established routines, rituals, and ways of interacting that became the fabric of my understanding of life. Morning coffee with a light hum in the background, the sound of laundry machines blending with faint music from the living room, the organized chaos of groceries and errands, every small detail communicated care, stability, and continuity. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary actions, but they held immense significance. And when she was gone, the absence of this rhythm left the house hollow, like a musical instrument whose strings had been cut. Her passing also revealed the invisible labor she had performed for years. I began to notice what had been taken for granted: the careful meal planning that ensured we ate healthily despite our modest means, the meticulous budgeting that kept bills from piling up, the constant emotional check-ins with me and my sibling, the way she smoothed over conflicts between neighbors or friends, always quietly, never seeking recognition. These acts, unnoticed by most, were monumental in their cumulative impact. And now, in her absence, the enormity of what she had done became painfully clear. Educationally and socially, she had instilled in me resilience and curiosity. She emphasized the importance of learning, of observing, of questioning. I had grown up believing that intelligence and empathy were intertwined, that knowledge without kindness was hollow. Yet, she also taught me the delicate art of patience, patience with oneself, patience with others, patience with life's uncontrollable rhythms. These lessons, subtle in their delivery, became essential as I navigated the years after her death. Without them, the world would have felt impossibly cruel, unbearably empty. Family dynamics were complex. My sibling and I relied on her not just for practical support, but for emotional guidance. We had disagreements, moments of teenage rebellion, and silent resentments, yet she never abandoned us. Her approach was steady, fair, and compassionate. Losing her meant losing the mediator of our conflicts, the steady hand that prevented minor disputes from escalating. I realized, in hindsight, that much of my emotional stability had been scaffolded by her presence. Without her, we were untethered, forced to navigate our relationships without the compass that had guided us for years. Romantic relationships and friendships were also colored by her influence. Growing up with her example, I developed an ideal of love grounded in care, empathy, and endurance. I learned to value depth over superficiality, sincerity over charm, and commitment over fleeting excitement. But I had also absorbed, unconsciously, fear of impermanence. Love, in my mind, was constant, unshakable, and meant to last a lifetime. Losing her shattered that assumption. I was suddenly confronted with the reality that even the strongest bonds can be severed, leaving devastation in their wake. All of this context, the economic pressure, the cultural expectations, the emotional labor, the family dynamics shaped the way I experienced grief. My response was not simply personal. It was entwined with societal structures, historical forces, and cultural norms. The pressure to remain composed, to perform, to endure silently, intensified the isolation I felt. And yet, paradoxically, also prepared me in small ways for the journey that lay ahead. The strength, patience, and empathy I had absorbed from her would become essential tools in navigating a world without her. It was during this period that I began to recognize the duality of her influence. On one hand, she had provided security, guidance, and unwavering love. On the other, her constant presence had shielded me from the full weight of emotional autonomy. When she was gone, I was forced to confront not just grief, but the necessity of self-reliance, of cultivating resilience, and of discovering ways to nurture love and connection independently. This was terrifying, but it was also a revelation. For the first time, I realized that love is not only a gift we receive, but a skill we must learn to cultivate, even after the deepest losses. Even small, mundane aspects of daily life became emotionally charged in her absence. The smell of laundry detergent, the sound of the refrigerator humming, the pattern of light on the kitchen floor, all reminders of routines she had established, routines that had conveyed care in ways words never could. I noticed how much of my emotional education had been encoded in these small, repeated gestures. Her love had been in every careful placement of objects, every note of encouragement, every subtle gesture that signaled attentiveness. And now, stripped of her presence, I had to carry forward the lessons embedded in these tiny acts of devotion. In reflecting on this, I realized that my mother's life had prepared me for the very thing I feared most: navigating the absence of love without succumbing to despair. Her resilience, her empathy, her quiet strength all became guides for the difficult path ahead. It was not a path I could have chosen or anticipated, but it was one I was now compelled to walk. Every decision, every moment of reflection, Every struggle to find equilibrium was informed by the foundation she had laid. The context of her life, the societal pressures she endured, and the cultural norms she navigated had indirectly equipped me with the tools necessary to survive, grieve, and eventually, to love again. The interplay between personal experience and societal context also became evident as I observed others coping with loss. Friends who had lost parents expressed similar struggles, navigating grief while maintaining appearances, managing responsibilities while confronting emotional collapse, and struggling to reconcile the permanence of death with the persistence of love. I recognized that my story, though deeply personal, was part of a broader human experience. Grief is universal, yet it is profoundly shaped by culture, society, and personal history. Understanding this context allowed me to situate my own suffering within a larger framework, giving me a sense of perspective even amid profound pain. And so, in the months following her death, I began to piece together the full scope of what her life had meant not only as my mother, but as a woman navigating the world with courage, dignity, and compassion. Her struggles, her triumphs, her routines, her sacrifices all became part of the emotional scaffolding that would support me as I confronted the immense challenge of grieving, surviving, and ultimately learning to love again. I realized that her legacy was not only in memories, but in the way she had shaped my capacity for empathy, resilience, and connection. Losing her was not simply the end of a chapter, it was a profound, painful, and ultimately transformative turning point that would define the rest of my life.